Hello and welcome to Nerdarchy. For nerds, by nerds, I'm Nerdist Dave, and today I'm hanging out with Christian Hoffer from comicbook.com. How are you doing today, sir?
I am doing very well. How are you?
I'm doing good. So we've just been chatting for a little while, and I look down, I'm like, oh, it's time to go live. So how's your apocalypse going?
We are hanging in there. Me and my wife had our second child in the middle of all that. Oh, of course, that's my alarm saying that it's time for this to start. But it's been going as well as can be expected. So it's a little bit hard to balance work and life right now because I have a home office, as you can see behind me, and I feel like I just live in here now.
Pretty much. That sounds about right. Like I've talked to people who don't normally work exclusively from home, and they're like, I'm not doing anything right now. I feel like I should be working for some reason.
Yeah, I mean, I've always really struggled with that because, I have two jobs. One of them is with comicbook.com. And usually when I'm home, I'm working on comicbook.com stuff. But now I'm working my other job, and since I'm here in my home office, I'm just like, I should be working on writing articles or prepping features, or I always feel like I'm constantly behind, which is a bit of an experience.
You just threw up a Call of Cthulhu 5e D&D article the other day.
Oh yeah, yeah. Peterson Games. They are producing these, basically, Lovecraftian adventure paths. So they finished up with the first one. It's called Ghoul Island, where you're basically head to this island city and discover that the city has somehow actually become integrated with these intelligent ghouls. And so that is like one of the recurring mysteries here, is why are there these ghouls that are just openly walking in the streets, and why does no one care? And so the newest one is called Yig Snake Granddaddy, which is more of an exploration themed campaign where you're kind of heading into this prehistoric jungle and discover snake people trying to bring back the great old one Yig. So that's they're both pretty good. I had the opportunity to read through the first chapters of both adventure lines, and what really struck me about both of them is that, one, Peterson, he's a master at horror. He created Call of Cthulhu, and he is just really good with that Lovecraftian horror. But I was kind of curious, how does that, a really, horror driven thing like Call of Cthulhu, how's that going to sync up with D&D? And the answer is really well. He does a really good job of really blending that high fantasy, heroics with, Lovecraft.
Yeah, that is impressive because I find horror is actually like the hardest genre to run with D&D, because it's like players pretty much are trained and used to going out and killing the monsters,
Mm-hmm.
and horror really, done well, isn't about killing the monsters. It's more
No.
about suspense and setting a mood, and being afraid of the monsters. In D&D, we rarely are afraid of the monsters.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Pearson Games, they came out with a Cthulhu Mythos book, which basically establishes how to incorporate Cthulhu into your D&D campaign. And one of the things that you just take a look at when it's like, so you want to fight Cthulhu? Well, Cthulhu has a challenge rating of 30. Also, it's not actually Cthulhu; it's just his presence on Earth. And oh, by the way, he will drive you mad.
Like so they before they got sued, TSR had put out the deities and demigods book, and they had the Cthulhu mythos in there. Matter of
Mm-hmm.
fact, I believe it's a collector's item now if you happen to have one, but because they got pulled.
Yeah.
But it was just, I think, like, the stats were like Cthulhu just kills a die 6 adventurer every round. You just roll a d6, and that's how many of the adventurers are just gone.
Yeah. Yeah, that's like the sort of the thing that kind of surprises me about the whole thing is because Call of Cthulhu, it like you said, it's so much about like horror and stuff. You don't have any abilities to use weapons. Like, you have like a handgun and you're supposed to be fighting eldritch terrors. And so you're always playing on the back foot. With kind of on you're basically trying to stop something before it happens. But with D&D, like the entire point is, eventually I'm going to be at a high enough power that I can literally punch Cthulhu to death. And to watch them try to shift that responsibly and do it in a way that still feels D&D-ish, but doesn't disrespect the mythos at all, or this entire genre of horror, which is facing the unbeatable unknown. It's really fascinating. I really like it. It's some of the better third-party adventures that I have read. And yeah, if you have a chance to go and pick them up, you should. I think the PDFs are $14.99 for Ghoul Island, and those are available now. And they have a subscription service over at Peterson Games as well, which that's the other thing that I kind of liked about it, is it's an adventure path, which you don't really see those in D&D anymore. And I kind of appreciate that, like a little bit more old school mentality. I came up through Pathfinder. I didn't make the switch to D&D until only a few years ago. So my first high fantasy tabletop experience was with Pathfinder. So I actually like the adventure path style.
It was one of the things that Paizo really did well.
Yeah.
I mean, even before Paizo had Pathfinder, they were doing that for D&D.
Mm-hmm. No, because they did what is it, Age of Worms? That was an adventure path, right?
Yeah, well, they used to be the publisher for Dragon and Dungeon Magazine, and those things went internal for Wizards of the Coast. So then they started doing adventure paths, and then kind of like really soon after that, 4E was announced, and then they moved into doing Pathfinder. So I'm seeing a lot of Pokemon.
Yes.
Behind you. Have you tried the D&D version of Pokemon?
I have seen it. I have not actively played a campaign. One of my friends, I know he's dabbled in that like 5e like homebrew system. Yeah. I like to keep those kind of separated. Like my interests a little bit separated. I don't think I would appreciate a role-playing Pokemon experience beyond what I get in the video games. I do a Pokemon podcast, weekly for comicbook.com, and one of the running themes of that podcast is when you start to peel back the layers of Pokemon a little bit, you realize just how horrifying it is. And so I don't think I want to live in that world. I just prefer to observe it from afar.
Well, you've got these like tweens running around enslaving these creatures and basically, putting them into, dog fights and cockfights with them, essentially.
Yeah, and that doesn't even get it. I mean, that's just surface level. That's not even that's just like the accepted fact. It's like, one, there's no parental supervision here. Like apparently, in the Pokemon games, there's only like one game in which you actually see one of the protagonist's fathers, and he lives in another town. And that's just like that's the baseline. But it's like, you're not only are you enslaving like little tiny intelligent animals, some of them are human souls. So you're actually capturing like actual ghosts of people and forcing them to do battle, and like you're basically a necromancer. It's really terrifying. Like when you like really start to think about it.
Well, it is. I fight with the internet often about necromancers, and so most of them believe that that's okay to enslave the spirits of the dead. It's fine.
Well, I one of my in my first campaign, one of my players decided that he wanted to go from shifting from an ice sorcerer to necromancy, and so it was a phase for him, because eventually he returned back to ice because he got tired of dealing with all of the nitty gritty like trying to like manage all of his different like bone creatures. But his big thing was like, I'm only going to try to enslave the bad guys that we
Yeah.
kill. That's where I draw the line. It's like, oh, okay, that's the line that you draw. He's like, well, I'm not bad. I'm just dabbling in necromancy.
Yeah. That's not how morals work.
it's like well, thank goodness that alignment is continuously getting
nerfed,
pushed.
Yeah.
In D&D. Otherwise, we would have issues.
At this point, I think there's like a couple magic items that have an alignment requirement, and that's it. It's like they just didn't have the balls to just pull it out whole cloth.
Yeah. Well, I wrote an entire article about it because this all came up. It was really funny. So I wrote up an article talking about the history of orcs in D&D and how they relate to high fantasy, and the kind of the problematic aspects of orcs, and how D&D has kind of change course on that. Like my main issue with orcs is that it's the penalties and stuff and the monolithic cultures. And so I wrote this long article discussing what I thought was a very nuanced take. And the very first comment I got was like, well, what's even the point of alignment if you don't have entire races that are just preternaturally evil? I'm like, alignment doesn't do anything in D&D anymore. It's like, that's the worst argument you could make. Like, don't come to me trying to justify like orcs are evil because alignment is just a fancy, that is just flavor text at this point.
Yeah, it does not mean much anymore. I kind of like though there being things that are like primordially good and evil in the cosmos, and giving that like simple black and white to a thing. Just because the real world is so complicated.
Yeah, I mean, in my games, what I tend to do is that there are some creatures that are definitely evil. They're usually corrupted by, the negative plane, the negative energy plane, or, demons, for instance. There's no such thing as a good demon. They are literally born, they are, because they're not of this world. My typical stance though is if it is on the material plane and it is not like a semi-intelligent monster, because you can like a beholder is one thing. Beholders are, of course, they're evil. They're giant floating eyeballs, with 9 more eyeballs, and they're freaking crazy. They clearly are not a natural thing. But I kind of draw the line of if a group forms a culture, then that you can't really say that something is good or evil anymore. Now that doesn't mean like for instance, I like to use the example of goblins in my things. Like that doesn't mean that you can't still have goblins who are just basically like these like vicious little like will stab you in the shins. Of course there are goblins like that, but there are also goblins out there who I'm sure like to wear fitted suits and eat caviar as well. And that makes playing on those expectations and then subverting them, I think, makes for some really good stories anyways. And also like I personally just have more fun with like, let's take a look at the ogre who's like, actually has like a very soft spoken voice and makes candles on the side. I think stuff like that, makes for a lot more experiences. Like, here comes the ogre with its big club and it's coming to bash your brains out. There's a little bit of subversion that I enjoy. But yeah, like, there can and should be absolute goods and evils in the world. I mean, especially when you start talking about like D&D's cosmology. Like, of course, there's, things like that. This is a world where angels exist and like, demons and devils and, that sort of stuff. I have no problem getting into. Like, there's like, you can safely assume there's no such thing as a good beholder. Although I think one of these days I will throw that in as a twist just for my party. It's like, just a beholder who is still acts like a beholder, but doesn't seem to be like actively plotting to like destroy civilization as we know it, just to see what how the players react.
So we have a video coming out. I think it's coming out next week. We kind of take a look at gnolls and how we'd make them as a player race. When you read the lore on gnolls, they're like, you're like, what's a good gnoll? And I don't. Someone might even answer this on Twitter from Wizards of the Coast. It's called a hyena, because they were just created by Yennegu just to be evil.
Yeah,
they were spawned.
So in the Forgotten Realms, Jeremy Crawford brought this up last week. I've got an article planned for it eventually, sometime this week. We've got D&D Live coming out this week, so it might not happen this week. But in the Forgotten Realms lore, I don't really look at hyenas. They are misidentified in the monster manual as humanoid, and really they should be monstrosities. They're basically semi-sentient demons created by Yeenoghu in Forgotten Realms. Now, in other planes such as Eberron or Wildmount, which I think those were the examples that Crawford said, he's like, no, those are humanoid. Therefore, they aren't bound by the same alignment as what's shown in the monster manual. So I think it really depends on like what the lore is. I mean, when something is created by a demon lord to specifically feed. I mean, that's what Yeenoghu's purpose is the gnolls are have this insatiable hunger because they're eating things and that literally gets funneled to Yeenoghu's belly. Then you can't really say like I said, it's just they're misidentified in the monster manual. The gnolls as shown in the core monster manual, they're not humanoids at all. They are monstrosities.
Yeah, I mean, I love the fact that they're described as being supernaturally evil, as opposed to culturally. And obviously, the caveat for any of this stuff is, like, in your own games, you can do it however you want.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, yeah. That is something that I've always, like, stressed to everybody. D&D, especially when it comes to these early looks at these like monolithic cultures, such as all orcs act this way. That's a weird take, and I think that largely the game should have outgrown it, probably an edition or 2 or 3 ago. But while that's a poor example that the D&D books give out, there's nothing. We have the internet out there, with all this wonderful alternatives. And so there's no need to, like I said, just because it says something in one of the rule books doesn't mean that you need to follow it. The core rule of D&D is, you do what you want. That is the central tenet of D&D, in my opinion. And that goes for the DM too, in terms of, world building and stuff like that. You are not beholden to what, Gary Gygax came up with 45 years ago.
Yeah, I believe it was back in AD&D that we started our Orc Kingdom of Gronor that, it was mostly an evil kingdom, tyrannical, but, you could have a mix of there, and they were kind of known for exporting Gronor steel and things made of it. So, it wasn't like an absolute, but see, D&D is weird in the sense that you have these mythos with the gods, like the creation mythos of the orcs is Grumsh is like, they made fun of him and laughed at him and said, oh, you have no place to put your people. And he's like, oh, really? And he created swamps and gorges and deserts and all these awful places. And, that's where his people went. So, I mean, in that regards, like, from the very beginning, there is more of a supernatural bent to all the creation mythos, right? So, but obviously, yeah, sure, their cultures could develop in different ways. But when you have, like, supreme beings, depending on how much access they have to that world, guiding a race's or species evolution, I feel like that could factor in too, and that might be something that gets overlooked.
I do agree with you in that, if a deity is actively influencing a culture, a culture's development, it gets into, an entirely different thing that there's not like really I mean, the closest equivalent you could have is like, how do religions impact real world cultures and societies and stuff like that? Like we can take a look at like, the Holy Roman Empire, and but the answer is that it doesn't do, frankly, jack shit.
Yeah.
Because I mean, it's like you're talking about like the Holy Roman Empire. They went and like how many crusades did we have? So I think that it is something. There's a lot of room depending on how you interpret the actions of gods, and how active of a role they play in the culture. But I think ultimately, if a god is influencing a culture so heavily to the point where let's say Grumish is like, yes, orcs, my orcs, go and kill that bunch of elves, and you're of course going to have orcs that are like, well, my god is telling me to go forth and kill these elves. What am I going to do? But the story, I think, to me, is what about the orcs who are like, why are we doing this? And that's something that maybe that's just the evolution of how fantasy story, of the evolution of the fantasy genre as a whole. But I think that it's really interesting because I like the idea that gods are imperfect, they're petty, they're kind of assholes. Like I like that Greek god mindset. Yeah. And so
basically the opening scene from Hercules.
Yeah, exactly. Like I really like when we were talking about gods like meddling in the realms of mortals. There's only one reason why they're doing that. It's because they're dicks. So I like the idea of people kind of coming to realize that maybe their deities are not as perfect or as ideal as they are led to believe. I think that makes for some really good storytelling within D&D and the wider fantasy genre. But like that's just my personal interpretation of it, because these deities, a lot of the stuff, while we didn't really have like a straight up Greek pantheon until they brought over Theros here in the last month or two. Like I really do feel like a lot of these pantheons, they're how their cultures kind of how they kind of like interfered in the ways of mortals and stuff like that. And a lot of these myths were at least maybe subconsciously inspired by that, like the Greek myths and stuff like that. That's because that's, and other ones too. I mean, like that's not the only culture to have myths in which like a deity directly interferes in the in the lives of mortals. But those sort of stories is where, at least my personal thought is, that kind of influences how we look at some of these things. And then and also I will note that D&D, I feel like in recent editions, has kind of like moved away from like the directly interfering. Someone pointed this out to me when I was talking about I was talking to some DMs Guild creators about the piety system that was just introduced in Mythic Odysseys of Theros. And I was like, it would be really cool if they did something like this for like Faerun gods, like the gods of Eberron. And somebody goes, that it makes no sense. Like that's not how those gods really operate. That kind of like, flies in the face of how, they used to operate, because we have these stories about like, Grumish, created the deserts and the swamps so the orcs have someplace to live. And, these gods have like a direct role in the, manipulation of, and the formative development of these cultures. And now they're kind of like, nope, I'm not touching this one, guys. Now, mind you, that might change here in a few days when they announce the next adventure. But
so we've had Dark Sun completely cut off. Eberron has kind of been like absentee landlords, essentially, is like how their pantheons have always worked. And then Forgotten Realms has been all over the place from the time of Troubles, when they're like, oh, we are stuck here on Earth or on Faerun with you, to also like there was a time where the Faerun deities operated more like the Theros deities are right now.
Yeah.
And I know they moved away from that. So it's kind of like that genesis is kind of interesting. And then you have Theros now, where it's like, oh, well, the god may inhabit this temple statue and crush your head because it doesn't like what you did.
Yeah.
Right? So you are all over the place. And even when you're talking about, well, if you look at like real world religions, but even then, it's like in real world religions, there's things that people say happened or were miracles, but not like in a fantasy world where no, the temple statue definitely got up, walked across the room, and knocked
Yeah.
that thing over because it was annoyed. And people do crazy stuff and bad stuff in the name of religion. On the, there might be something that happens, but when you take a fantasy world where a god can manifest and do stuff, that takes it to a whole new level, I think.
Yeah.
As far as to what you could get a society or a culture to do, when at least in the real world, you can't be like, maybe it's real, maybe it's not, but not in a high fantasy world where you're like, oh no, I just saw that person get brought back from the dead, or that person was just smited.
Some of my favorite characters in the different campaigns that I've run over the years are the atheist characters. Yeah. In this world where there are clearly gods that are actively interfering, and like a god shows up to go and talk to the party, and the atheist is like, yeah, no, I'm still an atheist. I'm over here. I'm good. And that for me, really opens things up. It really makes for some interesting thought experiments at the very least. My part of my college degree is was studying church history, and so it's really fascinating taking those parallels from how religion, Christianity took hold in Europe, and comparing that to how we interpret religion in a world where gods actively bestow magical powers on dozens, if not hundreds, of people at a time. And all for and there's no rhyme or reason to it either. You can have some really bad clerics and they're still getting the divine juju. So yeah, it makes for some really interesting deep thoughts. And I don't know if there's a perfect way of addressing it, because when you start blending real world philosophy with yes, elves, orcs, and dwarves, it takes you to some interesting places. I think that's the best way of describing it.
Yeah, there was a point in time where I'm like, there's no way you could live in these worlds and be an atheist, right? And then in the real world, I discovered people that still believe the world is flat. So I was like, oh, nope, I guess it could happen.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way of putting it. Well, maybe they're just really enlightened. It's no, they're not actually deities. They're just extra worldly, very long-lived creatures like the Asgardians in the Marvel universe. They're not really gods. They're just very powerful aliens who we just happen to worship.
Yeah, maybe they're just wizards with extra pointy hats. The pointier, the more powerful. So what is your favorite thing to write about over on comicbook.com? I know you do some D&D stuff, but you're also writing about Pokemon and other things over there as well, correct?
Yeah, no. So right now, my two principal responsibilities are Pokemon coverage and tabletop coverage, and that D&D is what we're the most successful with. Obviously, because I think it is, it's probably the most popular tabletop game, period, that's out there right now. So I really do like writing about D&D. I wish I could write a little bit more of it. It doesn't, we get a good amount of traffic for D&D, but it doesn't compare necessarily to when the latest when a new Pokemon appears or something like that. That still seems to, there's a disproportionate amount. I don't know if it's just because I've been writing for Pokemon about Pokemon for a lot longer, or what. But I probably like writing about D&D the most. I really liking to share my experiences at the table and trying to turn those into, I don't want to say teachable moments, but kind of presenting somebody who, I've racked up a lot of hours DMing, but it's all been in the last 5 years. And so, kind of presenting this mix of I am experienced at doing this stuff, but at the same time, I don't have the experience of somebody who's been playing since the Red Box came out. I like writing about that. I don't get to do it as much as I'd like. I like getting to share. One of my most rewarding things to write about is getting to kind of, I don't want to say elevate is too strong of a word, but getting to spotlight different DMs Guild supplements and different like third parties. By the way, Nerdarchy is on my very short list. Like I have the PDF like actually up on my screen. I was hoping to get something written about this weekend, your guys' most recent publication, and I just ran out of time. But I really like doing that. I think because there's a lot of really good, like when I started writing about the DMs Guild, it had like a really not the greatest reputation. Because people were like, well, it's unsanctioned, you know, it's an unsanctioned marketplace. Everything's wild. It's like, no, there's a lot of great stuff on that. You just need to know where to look. Yeah. And so I really feel that in the about 2 years that I've been covering it, the reputation of the DMs Guild has really turned around because, a lot of really good creators use that as their primary platform, and people get to see that a lot more often now.
Do you have any tips for people that are shopping in the DMs Guild to kind of pick out the better stuff?
I think that the one, know what you're looking for. There is so much stuff that's out there. It can be just super overwhelming. So know what you're going into. Like, are you looking for an adventure? Are you looking for like player supplements to like enhance your game? Like I personally, as a DM, I like a lot of stuff that are kind of like different mechanics that kind of can be used to enhance. So like monster harvesting, for instance, things like that. I think, and then the other thing is that once you know what you're looking for, keep an eye on what the best-selling stuff is. Usually the best-selling stuff is, of very high quality. I can't think of too many things that I would take a look at something that is like on their best-selling that's like a silver or gold medal seller that's bad. Few examples of that, but that's just my personal opinion. Like those materials are usually of pretty good quality. So that would be my 2 recommendations there is try to avoid things that don't have a medal because, the medals are all based on sales. So, if it's a copper seller, I think like 50 people have bought it. If it's a silver seller, then I think it's either 100 or 200. And, the more people who buy those, surprisingly, typically a lot of those sales are by word of mouth. Or because a creator has built up a reputation of releasing quality materials. The other thing is just take a look at who's kind of picked up like the big followings on Twitter. If that's like there's a lot of creators who maybe don't have like thousands of followers on Twitter, but there are also some who have made basically a career out of being DMs Guild creators. So that's the other thing is like typically you can't make a living of it, especially on a marketplace, a loosely regulated marketplace. If your material is not very good, the cream does rise to the top in that case. Yay, capitalism.
Yeah. So how did you start working for comicbook.com? How did you get started there?
It's a very odd story. So way back when I was in college, I ran a site called The Outhouse, which was a comics-based website. And a few years into me like being actively involved with it, we went from trying to do earnest coverage of comics, and one day I just got really ticked off at something, and I wrote the most sarcastic article I think I had written up to that point, and it got tons of hits. And so we literally shifted to The Onion. Now, I will say this. We had a lot more misses than we did hits, had hits back in those days. Like, I'm very embarrassed by a lot of the output that we did on The Outhouse. But one of our frequent targets was actually comicbook.com. And this was back when they were kind of a more... they were a much smaller site. They did a lot of their stuff. I mean, if you compare comicbook.com to a comparable site, we pump out a lot more articles. It's just part of our ethos. We try to cover as much as we can. We don't really pad things out that much. So we have discovered that instead of you getting like 5 news chunks in an article, you're going to get 5 articles with 1 news chunk each. And I think, people have different opinions about that style of producing content, but it really works for us. And so we used to like really make fun of them for it. But my boss had recently joined that site, had recently gotten hired by that site. And around the time that I had quit writing for the Outhouse for personal reasons, he approached me and he's like, "Hey, do you want to come and write for us?" I'm like, "What? Like, why in God's name would you do that?" He's like, "You're a good writer. That's why." He's like, "Yeah, I need feature writers. I need people who know things about comics. You are a good writer. You are clearly capable of, producing, long form features when needed. And yeah, let's do it." And so they hired me on. That was back in 2015. It was the week that my oldest son was born. And so it's like all these life changes all at once. I suddenly had a new job doing something that I've always wanted to do. I've always wanted to write professionally. And then from there, for a while, I was just writing stuff like top 10 features. Like, we do a lot of stuff like, it's Flag Day. Here are 7 heroes that incorporate the flag into their costumes. It wasn't the best thing in the world, but a lot of it was a lot of tongue-in-cheek writing, and my editor, was comfortable with that. And then he asked me back in about 7 or 8 months into it if I wanted to start writing about Pokemon. He's like, "Yeah, you like Pokemon, right?" I was like, "Yeah, I like Pokemon." I this had not happened yet. So this was when I was more of like a filthy casual about Pokemon. I was like, "Yeah, I'll write about Pokemon." And then Pokemon Go happened. I was suddenly writing 12 to 15 articles a day about Pokemon Go in addition to my day job. And I never looked back.
12 to 15 articles a day? How many words is that?
Back then it was back then my article lengths were 200 words per article.
Okay.
So that would be about 2,000 to 3,000 words a day, I think.
Yeah.
Now to how the internet and Google and SEO has shifted. Now my articles are 300 to 400 words for a news article. But yeah, that was both the best month of my life and the most miserable month of my life. It came with lots of good and lots of bad. But yeah, from there, I kind of never stopped writing about Pokemon from there. I write at least 2 Pokemon articles a day, if not more. Plus, I run a weekly Pokemon podcast. And yeah, then I kind of started getting burned out on Pokemon. So my boss was like, "What else do you want to write about?" I was like, "I want to write about D&D." And he laughed at me. He's like, "Okay, Christian, go ahead, write about D&D." And
we're still being mocked. We're still being
well, he was just like, "There's no one cares about D&D." And so Old Spice, that was literally the week that Old Spice released their 5th edition, gentleman's class. Yeah. So I wrote up an article about it, and it was the top article that comicbook.com had gotten in terms of traffic that year. It was and by year end, it was still a top 10 article after all the Marvel movies, all the DC movies, all that stuff. And there's some stupid article about Old Spice releasing a D&D class. And so my boss is like, "Go ahead and write D&D as much as you want." Yeah.
In your face, editor guy. So speaking of D&D, how often are you getting to play now?
4 days. I run 4 campaigns a week. So yeah.
Do you sleep? What do you how do you write so many articles, have a day job, and play 4 games a week?
I don't do very much else. I am lucky. So one of my campaigns, the campaign that I actually run for comicbook.com right now, there's a group of writers, most of whom have never played D&D before, and so they asked when this quarantine happened if I would run a D&D campaign. So I'm using Sly Flourish's Runes of the Grendel Route, which is a fantastic adventure. I do very little prep for it. and I kind of just like, let it fly. Like, let's see what happens. So, like I'll read the chapter in advance, make a few notes, but no more than an hour prep for what's like 3 or 4 adventures, and it's very much fly by the seat of my pants. And like, it's really funny because like, the players are, man, these are such great adventures. And it's like, man, I'm so glad that, you have such a good word. It's like, I can't even remember the name of the cities that, we're running in. It's like, that one, there's a kind of like established settlement called Deep Delver's Enclave that's at the top of this like cliff. And then at the bottom of the cliff is a city called Shadow Reach. The only reason I know that city is called Shadow Reach is because I have a post-it note that's right here that says Shadow Reach. Because I kept forgetting the stupid name of that stupid city.
Well, my understanding is if you were to run that with a lot of prep, Sly Flourish would come to your home and take the adventure away from you.
Yeah, I feel like, I'm really keeping up in the spirit of that, and actually reading how he sets up the adventures has really helped with my other campaigns. So, my like longest campaign right now, I'm running, it's a homebrew world that's all based around the Demon Lords. And that's now, we're over 2 years old at this point. And we're kind of like we're just starting to get to the juicy bits, because apparently I'm a glutton for punishment. I don't know how to do quick paced D&D campaigns. That thing has moved at a snail's pace for now over 2 years. I still don't know why my 6 players haven't just revolted and like given up on me yet. So that I used to do so much prep work where I'd write like basically small chapters for every freaking session. And now, because of the lessons I've kind of like picked up, one from just knowing how to do it now, and also like looking at how, the Sly Flourish, the Lazy Dungeon Masters guides and stuff like that, it's really helped me refine things a lot, which I feel is nice. So that has really helped minimize it. And I've kind of like at this point in time, I know where that story is going. And my players I'm able to correctly figure out what my players' motivations are like 90% of the time. So, when they do surprise me, it's great, but it doesn't happen too terribly often. So I'm kind of able to plan for that. But the campaign, the most recent campaign that I started doing, which is technically with my original tabletop group, like, that is the group that I started DMing for, 4 years ago. And we did Pathfinder campaigns, and we did D&D campaigns, and now we're doing a Westmarch style campaign. So that runs 2 nights a week. And that has been a fun experience. But a lot more prep goes into that than probably the other campaigns.
A lot of charts and tables.
More like so I have a hex map. Right now it's 19 hexes. That is like tier 1 adventuring. And the big thing that I have to do with that is we don't really do. I quickly did away with random encounters in that, because I realized that they ate up too much time, and they weren't really like satisfying to the players. So what I did to try to preserve the exploration aspect is I've homebrewed an entire exploration mechanic that is loosely based off what you see in the Acquisitions Incorporated book, where each player has a different corporate role. So I kind of took that and reskinned it for exploration. So you have a navigator who's basically in charge of getting players from point A to point B. You have a scout who is, kind of, while the bulk of the party is moving forward, they are the ones who find these random encounters on a successful check and can choose to, avoid it. You have the lookout who, their job is to basically make sure that no one gets ambushed. And so on a lot of these random encounters, when they do happen, they're the ones who determine, do you get the drop on them or do they get the drop on you? And then you have stuff like the forager who, they're in charge of, they sometimes find like interesting plants, but their mechanic is basically on a success, we do, success and full success. So it's 2 different DCs. So on a full success, the players gets, basically come away with so much excess food that they make money. And on a, failure, they basically have to tap into their reserves and cannot, successfully forge and therefore have to tap into the supplies that they have on hand to lose gold. And so we have different roles, and that kind of like actually forms up the bulk of the story. But they find a lot of things that they can explore on future sessions. Or now we just started. It was always designed as a West March campaign, but then the quarantine happened, and so like my players were like, "Well, we're not doing anything. Why are we going to open this up to other people? Like we're just going to do this. It's going to be the same people every freaking week." So we kind of like had like, okay, at level 2 it's just this one group of adventurers, but now that you guys have had some success and the company, the exploratory company that you work for, has more gold. They've hired more adventurers to come in, and there's a little bit of tension now. And now they're just running around and cleaning up the messes of each other. So one group will accidentally unleash a plant zombie dragon, and then they're like, well, we're out. Have fun with that, other party. And so like the other party had already planned to like go into that same like area, and they have to deal with a plant zombie dragon that's flying around. So that has been an interesting experience. So it's a little bit more prep work, but even that has, now that I'm refining how those exploration rules take, that's what takes the longest, is figuring out what is an interesting thing for them to do while exploring, because I feel like that is the big failure of 5th edition, is there's no exploration mechanics. It's not, you take a look at it, there's not a really great system out there.
It's not interesting for the players to do. It's also the greatest failing of the ranger. It's the part they do really well, and it's the part that gets glossed over, so the value of the ranger kind of goes down. Have you looked at from Cubicle 7 Adventures in Middle Earth?
I have not had a chance to really dig into that. I know they have some better exploration mechanics than what is offered.
Basically, what you described is their journey mechanics.
Well, it's nice to know that great minds apparently think alike. I keep getting told this because I'm like, look at this revolutionary system I've come up with. And like people are like, you mean the Dungeon World system? Or, yes, the Journeys in Middle Earth system. I'm like, okay, well, clearly I'm not as smart as I thought I was.
Or equally smart as those other people. So, depending on how you want to look at it. Brian had a question. Looking for anything to help me come up with a good dramatic high stakes gambling scene or Battle of the Bands type scene. Any DM guild items or homebrew stuff come to mind?
There are a couple of tavern based gambling things. I don't think there is a specific, I can't think of off the top of my head if there's a specific book that deals with just, so you want to gamble in D&D. I can say from personal experience, I love Battle of the Bands stuff. In one of my games, the party has a band. They are known as the Bad Hags. They get probably 50% of their misadventures are tied to the Bad Hags putting on performances in places where they shouldn't. So I encourage you to go out and find something like that. I feel like, generally speaking, the key to those sort of encounters is, with any Battle of the Bands, is of course you need a good nemesis. But look in the tavern stuff. There are a couple of like really good tavern supplements, and I believe a few of those have things for gambling and carousing and stuff like that.
Yeah, we actually have a Taking Chances supplement over on our store that is tool uses and gambling and games and stuff.
Yeah, because push your luck mechanics really go hand in hand with D&D. I don't think those two ideas are really as, I think you can really easily port a number of push your luck mechanics or games into D&D without too much issue, because it's just rolls of the dice and see where it falls.
So Brian also wants to know, do you do any recaps, write-ups after sessions?
Me personally, so that's funny you should say that. I used to run I used to do a thing called Anatomy of a D&D campaign, which I still like periodically will run stuff under that header. but I do not do that as much anymore because the people just aren't always interested in how other people's D&D campaigns go. I do tend to recap things on Twitter. I have a private Word document so that in my West Marches campaign, so the players can keep track of each other's shenanigans, and it's kind of like in game. It is the official company log that basically it chronicles this company's adventures as they try to explore this mysterious land.
And as always, in the comments, there's a pinned comment where you can find Christian on the interwebs, including Twitter. So if you want to follow him, or you should follow him, go check it out, and then you can see what he's talking about over there. Yeah, that kind of content is very like you'll get a small but very loyal base to that kind of stuff. But then, like, as content creators, like, we look at the numbers and go, is this really worth doing?
Yeah.
When you're like, this is going to get a third of the interest of anything else I could do.
Yeah, and with me, I am blessed in that comicbook.com gives me a wide amount of leeway to write what I want. However, I kind of have to justify it. And so, I just don't think it's this is just my personal ethos. It kind of feels very, I don't know. I'm a writer and I can't think of the right word. It just kind of feels weird to write about my own experiences unless I can turn it into something like teachable. We have lots of fun moments in all of my games. Like in the West Marches, what happened this weekend is one party got their butts handed to them by a tree blight. Like as they were going through this kind of like corrupted woods, and this tree blight ambushed them, killed the cleric, killed the rogue, beat the snot out of the rest of the party. It was a blast, but they eventually killed the tree blight. Everyone was fine. We didn't have, any permanent party members die. And then another party came across the corpse of said tree blight, and some assassin vines and a sap demon had taken root in there. And so then the assassin vines and the sap demon proceeded to beat the snot out of a different party, and it turned into a whole at the end of it, it had beat up our poor fighter, who was like the very first combat encounter, and we had two players go down again. And at the end of it, like one of the warlocks is like, I burned the tree. I would like to set it on fire and make sure that this fallen tree can no longer kill anybody else who comes through here, because I am done with it. And it provided for some fun moments there. Yeah, I don't know, it's always really interesting reading through old Dragon magazines, and because they would occasionally run write-ups of some random gaming group and based out of Wisconsin. Here's what happened in one of their random adventures, and it's so it's always been part of the D&D content experience. But I always I'm always curious about how much people are actually interested in that sort of thing.
Okay. Brian meant for your groups. I try and make them do the write-ups when I can.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things is for the West Marches, I have asked them if they can to at least provide with summaries. The West Marches, for those of you who aren't super knowledgeable about that, it's this kind of quasi open campaign. People come and go. They choose where they go. I don't really play any part of that. And so kind of keeping up in that, DM is kind of hands off. They're in charge of tracking their inventory. They're in charge of tracking NPCs, all that stuff. They have charts for all that. I only occasionally go in and clean those up, basically to correct, egregious NPC misspellings. But we, the company log, I do try to actively keep track of, but the party mostly handles that. I don't really touch that too much.
I find it super useful because it points out what was important to the players when they give you their feedback and they do the write-up, and they totally gloss over what you thought was the key point, and you're like, I guess that doesn't matter. And me personally, I will just chuck that and focus on the things that they thought were important and be like, yep, that's it.
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the most useful. I like to have, in a lot of my campaigns, I like to try to have my parties tell me what happened in the last session. Not only does it do a good job of, forcing them to, get engaged so they can remember, but it also allows me to realize what sort of things they find interesting from the game before. I think that's a good thing that every DM should do, is have your party recap what happened at the last session at the beginning of your next session. That's just a good like D&D 101 tip there.
So, from talking to you, I know you write like million articles a day. How many articles are going up that you write a day, or what's the frequency?
Right now, it's between like 3 and 7. So, like I said, I do have another job, and some of my stuff is we're trying to get deeper into more tabletop coverage, like just general like games. So we're trying to like spotlight a lot of like board games that are coming out this summer, especially because convention season is canceled. So how else are people going to find out about the games? Because if you go to Board Game Geek, your eyes will immediately start to melt because that they haven't updated that site since 1995. Board Game Geek is a wonderful site. Just their front page is a bit of a mess. Like, it's a great database. I think I appreciate a lot about it. It's just like, if you go there to look for news, let me know what you find. And there's just not a lot of good resources out there to let people know about upcoming board games. So I'm trying to do more stuff like that. But, it just depends on what the news of the day is. And unfortunately, we are a news site first, so a lot of my features kind of get pushed out into the weekends. So if you're looking for like, let's read 1,000 words about what Christian thinks about things, don't expect to see that until like Saturday or Sunday, because I'm usually writing news or news adjacent features. Like, I wrote a bunch of Pokemon stuff before I came over here, because there's a downloadable content that's coming out this week, and we know some more information about that.
Now, I'm not saying Board Game Geek specifically, but I am saying some websites, you go to them and you're like, yeah, the 90s want their website back, please.
Yeah. Yeah, that is not specific to BGG. And like I said, they did make some big improvements a couple of years ago, which made that I feel bad. Like, I trashed BGG, and now I'm immediately like backpedaling on it because I feel like I'm like being too mean to them. I will say this, that is like one of the few sites that, still has an active forums and like, has a thriving forum base, which is something that I personally, as a child of the internet forums and like the 90s and 2000s miss. So good for them on that. Lots of great communities on there. Just like I said, their front page is a little bit hard to navigate. I think in part because they just have so much stuff that they want to try to put in front of their viewers.
And also too, it just depends on like how big their team is, what they have working on things, and like as somebody that just plugs in the information, and it's really easy to go, why doesn't this look better? But now on the other side, like, I am our webmaster, and that is not good because that's not what I do.
I used having run multiple of my own sites, and I'm about the same place. Whenever you're relying on me to be the webmaster, you're in a world of hurt. However, I'm allowed to, like now that I have the full backing of CBS to manage my front page, they're the ones who design it. All I do is plug in articles from here or there, let CBS deal with that.
I've been told that like our site looks really impressive, and I'm like, it still needs work. We're in the process of updating it now. And it has not. It's been. We've updated it a couple times, but when you don't have like a programmer on staff or a developer on staff, that stuff is hard because every time you have to update something on your site, you're like, oh, no whammies, no whammies, no whammies.
Yeah. So I run a comics festival. In my copious amounts of free time, I am the showrunner for a comics festival here in Columbus. And, our website is just awful. And it's been the biggest criticism that we have gotten in our, 5 years of existence. It's like, oh, yeah, I love the fact that, you have everyone from, Brian Bendis to Dave Pilkey come here. But please, for the love of God, do something about your website. And, we're finally trying to do something about the website. And it's just there's so many headaches coming from that. And I get looked at like, you know, I'm the operations manager for this festival, and I'm kind of like the youngest person that's involved with it. And they're like, oh yes, 30 something, you're proficient with websites. I'm like, no, no, I am a writer. I am not a programmer. What are you doing?
That, you know, I kind of lament on this often, is like with this, all the stuff that we do, it's like, you know, every singular thing, whether it's running Twitter, Facebook, the YouTube channel, editing, like all these things are their own job, right?
Yeah.
And then when you do something like you're talking about, like running a festival, and you have to do all the jobs yourself, like the biggest like aha moment was going out to California, to LA, to Geek and Sundry, and, you know, getting to see the Nerdist and the Geek and Sundry bullpens. It was kind of depressing, to be honest with you, because you're like looking at, like, you know, a dozen people, and you're like, oh, I do all those jobs.
Yeah, that, I mean, I'm on like both sides of it, you know, because comic book, I mean, we're still lean enough. Like, we don't have a dedicated like social media manager. Like, we handle all of that ourselves. But, you know, we do have like an entire like editing team. We have like an entire like web team, an ad team. And it's like, I remember when I used to be the person who had to do that sort of stuff for a much smaller site. And it's just like, I will never go back to that. It is like, no, thank you. I will perfectly be content with being a cog in the machine.
That, you know, that is the beauty of it. So we are about to get off here. So, but before we do, what can people look forward to seeing from you in the near future?
Well, I can say this, coming out this week, D&D Live is this weekend, and that is where the newest adventure will get announced. Now, if you have been following comicbook.com, you probably already know what that adventure is or is likely to be, but should have lots of coverage about that. There is as I mentioned earlier, there's a Pokemon downloadable content. The first ever for a Pokemon game, so we will have full coverage of that. I'm actually taking the week off from my day job, specifically to do D&D Live and this Pokemon stuff. So that's what I'll be doing this week. In terms of other upcoming projects, you know, I have a weekly Pokemon podcast. It's called A Wild Podcast Has Appeared, that you can find wherever Pokemon are found, wherever podcasts are found. You know, so that is with two of my comicbook.com you know, fellow employees there. But other than that, mainly you can find me trying to keep my head above water. We'll be running a lot more D&D content in the weeks ahead. I would really like if, you know, I am able to share more tales of my, you know, very experimental West Marches campaign, which, you know, for as lauded of a campaign style as West Marches is, there is not a lot of content out there about that. So I would like to kind of demystify that a little bit, and explain how to turn those things into a success, because most people are like, yeah, I want to run a West Marches campaign, and then you find out how much work goes into that, and you're like, no, I want nothing to do with that anymore.
Oh, maybe it needs to be a DM's Guild guide or something.
I've thought about it. I actually have an entire binder full of notes on my West Marches campaign. So maybe one day further down the line, when this thing wraps up, I can kind of collate all that into like a campaign setting guide, and, you know, explain to people, here's the way to be successful on this and make it fun without you know, and also minimize the amount of work that you have to put into it.
Nice. Well, with that, I want to thank you for hanging out with me today, and until next time, people, stay nerdy.